Ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the question and answer session for, what are we doing, Jeremy? We're doing question and answer session for libertarianism. Whew, I just asked Jeremy that, so he confirmed libertarianism. Thanks. And again, you can sign up for the class. Actually, we had a couple of spaces open up because a couple of people had to drop out. So a few more people would be great. And yeah, I'll put the link below. It'll be 9th, 10th, 11th of October in beautiful Terrasse-en-le-Ville in France. So if you always want to visit France or come to the Dordogne, take a philosophy class, that would be wonderful. Link will be below. All righty, Jeremy, kick it off with some questions on libertarianism.
All right. Good evening, Wes. The first question's from Action, and they say, I think you're mischaracterizing libertarians' point of view here a little bit. It's not that they want to use the roads without paying for them. It's that they aren't given the option to pay for the use of them or not. They would undoubtedly support privately owned toll roads because this would open up the road system to the free market as opposed to government coercion.
Yeah, no, this is the history problem, which is I mean, probably I'm mischaracterizing slightly because we kind of sort of narrow things down to talk about general themes and attitudes in an hour, right? So that's probably fair enough. But so this is the history problem. So, but all the roads are built, not all the roads, but lots of roads are built. And they're not built under a system that the libertarians approve of. So what they are functionally saying is, I don't want to pay for things I didn't want to have built, which is fair because they were built before you were born, but I want to use them, or I'm almost required to use them, right? And so this notion of imagining that history doesn't exist and that we don't live in a place that has this overhang of social assumptions and cultural design and biases and all this simply makes it impossible to think accurately about the world and to come up with solutions and interactions. This doesn't mean things shouldn't be changed, by the way, because you could say the same thing for slavery and go, oh, slavery, you say slavery wrong, and somebody says, well, slavery has always existed. So the question that if you really wanted to pursue serious libertarianism would be to say, how do we transition from a place where we have, if we just stick with roads, we have 75 years or more of really billions and billions or trillions of dollars at this point of money invested in roads. How do we transition from a shared, communally built, tax-supported system to a private system? Now, that might be a reasonable debate to have, but this is going to take decades, obviously, and would be a huge titanic shift in the way culture and road construction was organized, which, again, that doesn't make it wrong. It just means that saying that, oh, government shouldn't do it and private industry should, when it exists, is sort of, now you're dodging the historical cultural question, which is, of course, the most important one, I would argue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the roads issue kind of touched a nerve for some people. At the end of this second question, the person wrote, the roads issue is tiresome. So I think libertarians might hear this kind of complaint a lot, and maybe they're tired of defending it or something like that. But yeah, but the beginning of this question is from @thecomrade, is the biggest aspect of American libertarianism for me is the ethical framework that tries to eliminate conflict. If you see the ideas through this lens, you can see why self-ownership is useful and has its place. And then it says the roads issue is tiresome. So just wanted to ask you to talk a little bit more about roads and what he's talking about with ownership and ethical frameworks eliminating conflict.
Right. So I think the idea here is if you have a free market, then people don't have to fight for their rights or liberties or all of this, and you can negotiate in good faith with other individuals. And therefore, you don't have a need for violent conflict. Whether that is apt, I'm very suspicious of this idea, because you're like, okay, how do you create this framework and on what rules? And again, we'll just drop the roads issue, but the issue with the question at heart of libertarianism, I think, is a great one. This is the thing, is to say what society creates the freest possible individuals. and how that's best way for them to interact? This is a great question, right? This is a fundamental. This is why many libertarians, particularly early libertarians, consider themselves liberals in the Enlightenment sense of liberalism, because let's liberate the individual, let's make them free exercise of conscience. So this is all, I think, valuable question to ask. Where I struggle is that more often than not, vastly more often than not, that question is treated as an answer rather than as a question, because there's so many elements of what it means to be free, as I mentioned, and so many aspects of the necessity of living in a culture. So individuals cannot live freely on their own. This does not, one, it's not even a choice anymore. And two, it disregards the fact that we're social animals and that we have to live with other people. And so it's how best to organize the interactions of individuals. And libertarianism comes in so often assuming so much. It assumes that you have a government in place that can enforce the free market model on the individuals that participate within that government. Now, the problem with that is, of course, this just, okay, we have a government that makes the free market possible, and well, okay, what's the form of that government? Like, how does representation work? How does the divisions of power work? Like, it doesn't tend to look at those questions or want to ask those questions, and it pushes them off to the side. And so what I find, again, tiresome for me about libertarianism is it avoids all these core questions that the central question raises, and then pretends like they don't exist and says, well, if we have a free market and free individuals can negotiate freely, then yeah, that's better. And then violence, absolutely. What is the government that makes that possible? How does that government defend itself? Does it have the right to use violence if it wants to defend itself against internal or external enemy, right? And how does representation, if any, work? Is it better to have a totalitarian state that does that? And so on and so forth. And so these really fundamental questions of cultural and social organization, even within the context of how do you create a free market structure and what legal systems exist to defend that, are not invariably but generally treated with a wave of the hand. And this is why I think Hayek is such a great example. He's a great counterexample, even though he's generally considered one of the founders of libertarianism and of neoliberalism, which, as I talk about in the next lecture, is he switches from those sorts of concepts into looking at the history of law and social structure and government structures, specifically because he was so vexed by, okay, I know what I want to see happen. How do I reimagine a social and governmental structure that makes it possible? And so his later writings, quite voluminous, deal at length and depth in like business law. Because if you're going to have all these business relationships or how we want to do things, then business law becomes the most important thing. But yeah, to me, it sometimes resonates as there's lots of fundamentalist Christians who never learn to read Latin or Greek, and much less Hebrew. And you go, wow, if the major texts of the revealed word of God was written in a language, and I believed in that, I would want to learn that language because that's the language of God, right? Is it Hebrew? Is it Aramaic? Is it Greek? Is it the early Latin scholars? Or probably all of the above.
Yeah.
But nobody does. Like, not nobody, but few people do. But most fundamentalist Christians absolutely refuse to do this because they don't want access to the revealed word of God. Similarly, libertarianism demands these questions, but they don't seem to aggressively pursue them, which is always surprising to me, because it's like, oh, that's why I think people, even within the philosophical community, people can never decide if it's really that much of a philosophy, because it's a great question, but
Yeah.
the self-identified libertarians rarely pursue the very questions that it raises, and instead they pretend like they have answers.
Uh-huh.
So, yeah.
At the Comrade follows up with a second kind of a little bit mystical question. It's short. It says, libertarian ethics is not meant to address fear or give you freedom to read. This can be done on top or in parallel to libertarian ethics. Wanting a hammer to be a wrench is not the fault of the hammer. So it's kind of a cryptic question that I want you to interpret.
Okay, let me say, I think I understand.
Yeah.
And what he's saying is that libertarianism does not address the kind of freedoms like freedom from fear and freedom to read. That
Yes.
it's it's interested in other kinds of liberties,
Yes.
right? Okay. So saying that libertarianism is a wrench, don't yell at it for not being a hammer.
Yeah.
So the problem is right there in the title is liberty. And if the question you ask is what is the best system for creating free individuals, then I would think naturally, or by rational extension, one then says, okay, what are all the possible human freedoms? Which ones do we think are most important? And how do we possibly organize a society that makes those freedoms the ones that are most easily expressed, lowest barrier, most encouraged, most supported, as opposed to some of the other ones? And again, libertarianism tends to only focus on a very, very finite number of a particular flavor of freedom and says, oh, that's liberty.
Mm-hmm.
So freedom from fear, that's not really liberty. That's a different thing. The freedom to read, that's a different kind. But if you go, oh, if we think that everybody should have the freedom to read, this means you need some agreed system for making sure that everybody gets an education so they can read.
Yeah.
If you don't think that's an important freedom, then you say, well, we don't care about that. And we don't care if people learn to read. That's a personal choice. It's not an important freedom that the government is supposed to defend.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So conversely, they say property rights are super important, perhaps most important. Therefore, the government has to be organized to defend property rights, not intellectual rights or the right to read or the right to express yourself, but the right to own property and to be property. So what you're saying is not, oh, you've this is like I said before, you're pre-deciding which liberties really matter and not saying why those liberties matter and why those liberties are more important than other liberties. So freedom from fear is to say, oh, that's not that, if you're afraid, that's your responsibility to take care of that. The government has no role in making you feel safe or having police, or that this is not a governmental function. This is a personal function.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the history of that is not very pleasant, by the way. There's a reason people form societies for self-defense. It's because if you don't, bad things happen. And so, yeah, that kind of social, all these other freedoms, right? So what other freedoms are there? Should they be emphasized? What role, if any, does the government have to play in them? Again, I'm not saying that these should be the freedoms.
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying that you can't just assume that the one freedom that you like is the one that should be emphasized and that all other freedoms are tertiary, or follow necessarily from the one freedom. So
Mm-hmm.
you have to make that argument. You have to say why this is the most important freedom and why these other freedoms would necessarily follow from that. Here's an example of property rights that I've never seen addressed in libertarian stuff. By the way, I'm not vastly read in libertarianism, so I'm not saying it's not there someplace. But it's like, okay, you want to hand your property down, right? So you're going to die. So you say, okay, what do I do with my property? Now, one way to read libertarianism is you can do anything you want with it. You can give it whoever you want, however you want, whenever you want. Great.
Mm-hmm.
That's total liberty. In France, what they've said is that your children are part owners of any property of the parents because by birth. It's not just the parents' property, it's also the children's property. They've invested in it, they've grown up in it, they've participated in it. And so the parents do not have the freedom. So is this a case where the government is interfering with the freedom of you to dispose of your property? Or is it a case where the government is interfering and keeping somebody else of disposing of your property?
Uh-huh.
Right? Like it's the same question. Like who decides where the property rights fall amongst family members, amongst, all of these agreements? And again, remember, children don't have a choice.
Mhm.
So there has to be a pre-existing social decision on what happens with kids. If not, even if the decision is just parents can decide.
Mhm.
And so there's examples of this. Well, in England, they had primogeniture, which meant the oldest child got everything. And if any other kids were going to get anything, it had to be by special dispensation. France has the opposite, which is basically all the children get totally even. And there's ways around it, but it's quite difficult to avoid that.
Yeah.
And so, that's just different systems, but you have to have a system.
Mhm. And in this person's question, literacy would be farmed out to some sort of private system or something that this person didn't describe.
So this makes it voluntary, right? And
Mhm.
a decision that adults make. So
Mhm.
you're not going to, when do you get old enough to make the decision about whether or not you want to be literate? When you're 18?
Mhm.
Right. So see what that does to the opportunity to be literate, right? It moves it way down and takes it out. You don't have the freedom to choose because you're a child. And so
Right.
are you property of your parents that they dispense with how they see fit? By the way, this is the Roman model. In the Roman world, pater familias, which was the law of the father, basically, you could kill your children until they were something like male children until I think they were 26. When they became adults, it was very late. And they were your property. So if you wanted to, you could kill them. I think you could kill your daughters basically any old time. Anyway, that was the most extreme version. Of course, parents didn't go around killing their children, but they had sort of absolute authority over managing their children. So, yeah, so you could do that and say children are property, and you dispose of your property. If you don't want them to learn to read, they don't have to learn to read. But is that fair to the children who don't have the opportunity to make those decisions until they're 18? At this
Mhm.
point, think of how disabled you are to come into a world not literate because your parents have decided that you shouldn't be literate. Is that okay? Yeah, it's at
Mhm.
least arguable. And the fact that most of the civilized world has decided that's not okay is, I think, indicative, right? Like, nah, you should probably get your kids so they can read at least.
Right. At Action has a second question. To your second point about the disparity between the individual and the corporation, I believe their answer to this problem would be if a corporation is taking advantage of their customers, this would open up an avenue for a competing corporation to provide a better service. This is kind of what
Sorry about
this is what Madison was saying in the Federalist Papers about competing factions. It's the only way to check power. The only way to check power is to set the interests of one faction against the other.
Yeah. Now, this is actually, I laugh. I laugh because this is the like Platonic ideal of free market capitalism. The problem is, as Adam Smith notes, no two businessmen ever met together without the purpose of forming a monopoly. Right. This is what they are busy doing. One of the clearly recognized roles of government is to prevent monopoly power. However, governments, of course, turn out to be very poor at doing this because monopolies become very powerful and they influence government, et cetera, et cetera. So think of how many experiences you've had with very, very poor customer service or pricing structures or from huge companies for which you have little or no alternative choice. And if you think this is a question, I want to run this experiment to try traveling without a cell phone. Like, you can't get text messages, you can't get emails, you can't get this. You have no cell phone, you have no computer, and you want to travel someplace and you want to talk to people, right? Like, I think it may now be impossible. And so you can choose not to travel or you can choose to travel, but basically you're going to have a cell phone. If you're going to have a cell phone, okay, look what happened to your choices. Things get sketchy very quickly. Where I was before, not in France, but in the United States, there were only two companies that you could get a cell phone plan one, and one of them was terrible. Like they didn't have any coverage. So that left you with a choice of one or one. And you're like, okay, so should another company come in and fight with Verizon? Yes, everybody would have been super stoked for there to be another company to come in and steal customers from Verizon. The problem is it's very expensive. And as you see continually, what happens is a small company comes in, they open up to get some business, and Verizon says, here, have $1 billion. And they go, okay, I'll take $1 billion. And that company goes away, and now it's Verizon again. So competition, good, free market competition, good for lots of things. Again, I'm not anti-free market. I think for the distribution of all kinds of goods and services, the free market is a spectacular innovation. However, we all live in the world of giant corporate monopolies. We all are familiar with the cost of this. And so one question I would say to this person is, what changes do you think should be made in our current governing structure to increase free market competition? Which is a great libertarian question, actually, is to say, all right, clearly we have these monopolistic, hugely powerful corporations. We want more competition. What could the government do to encourage that? Right? What intervention from the government would you like to see?
Right. And this brings us into the next question that talks about neoliberalism. Sisg Bliss asks kind of a long question. I'm going to read the whole thing. Neoliberalism is basically the political ideology that all problems can be solved through trickle-down economic policies. Its fatal flaw is that wealth doesn't trickle down significantly. Critics of government fail to realize that government is just the biggest company, and all other companies are simply its subsidiaries. Capitalism is the economic ideology that financial might makes right. The goal of capitalism is monarchy, but that's not as efficient for innovation as free market capitalism, because at a certain scale, it's easier to block competitors than to innovate when attempting to achieve a competitive advantage. The optimal free market utilizes all economic tools, including social policies, to ensure that as many people can compete and are competitive as possible in the market.
Wow. Okay. I like nine questions there. Good observations. One, let's see, where do I start here? Read the first part again, please. Would you like to?
Yeah, neoliberalism is basically the political ideology that all problems can be solved through trickle-down economic policies. Its fatal flaw is that wealth doesn't trickle down significantly. So I think this person's suggesting that there needs to be some sort of oversight or social policies laid on top of it.
Yeah, and so unbelievably, let me defend neoliberalism for a second. And this, the next lecture, by the way, will be on neoliberalism. So stay tuned for that. But if you look at a chart of global poverty over the last 70 years, 60 years, which would be the kind of height of the neoliberal policies being implemented, wow, like an absolute transformation of the rates of poverty in the world. And so it's not just trickle down. I know this is sometimes presented that way, and I do want to defend it from that charge. But I see why people say this, because it does definitely trend in that direction, right? Like it does. There are many gravitational forces that draw it that way. But conceptually, neoliberalism makes the argument that it should distribute more efficiently the wealth that is available than any kind of government intervention directly in the marketplace. So I would say I would defend it slightly against that, particularly when you look at the amount of wealth that has been generated, particularly for the poorest people in the world over the last 60 or 70 years. It really has it has been a rising tide that has raised a lot of ships. Not all, unfortunately, but by historical standards, more than anybody had ever imagined anybody ever could. So it's been really a phenomenal achievement of a lot of these policies. This doesn't make neoliberalism right. It does mean that the allowing market forces to do some of this work turns out to be a really good idea.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was kind of a sidebar because we're talking about libertarianism, but
Yeah,
we kind of started to move over into the neoliberal
yeah,
stuff. So,
yeah. And so,
um,
as towards the tendency to be a government in corporations, and I mean, it's funny. Libertarianism really wants to make this fine distinction between the government doing things and then the free market. And I think a lot of the intellectual blindness that is generated by libertarianism is this binary opposition, because there is the government and free markets. And generally speaking, in economic history and political science history, they recognize a lot more players than that. That you have different classes that have different interests. You have civil society. You have the difference of shared property versus privately owned property. You have, the idea of the commons as it's generally discussed. So you have a lot of other ways of conceptualizing this, and to create a binary opposition and say one group over here, everybody else is over here, government is less is good, everything, and that makes everything better over here, so homogenizes the rest of society as to make it almost I just think it's too much. It's overly simplified. It's an oversimplification that does not help. And I understand this is a problem as someone who tries to simplify things into short lectures for YouTube, that it's always a risk. I'm sure I err on sometimes doing this, but when you oversimplify too much, you lose all the nuance. And when you say that there's the government and then everybody else, like you've got to talk about corporations, you got to talk about local versus regional versus uh, national governments. These are all very different things. You have small businesses. The notion that a mom and pop's coffee shop that you go to is a company like Amazon is a company is simply nonsensical, right? Like they're clearly running under totally different regimes. You relate to them differently. And this sort of desire for societal simplification is, I think, again, it's a warning sign that it's very Calvinist, by the way. Good people, bad people, government bad, everybody else good. Get rid of the good, bad government, then all the goodness will express itself, and Jesus will bless us. So it's that really dramatic black and white oversimplification. Not for everyone, by the way, but again, popularly speaking, this is how it's presented.
And what about the idea of treating corporations as people in the lens of libertarianism and neoliberalism?
Yeah, so this is obviously hugely controversial. The notion that I think on balance, this is probably proven to be a terrible idea. People say, well, let's just stop this. The problem is it's a legal question, right? It's a question of standing before the law. And if you look at what percentage of global trade is done with corporations, and then you just got rid of that legal entity, well, that would be challenging. So you got to have some transition. But one example, by the way, people say, why has housing become so expensive all over the world? Then one reason is that the corporations are buying a lot of property, and corporations live forever. So what companies do are theoretically they can live forever. They can theoretically immortal. And they say, well, if I buy something today that I know is going to be valuable in 100 years, and I think I'm going to be alive in 100 years, that's a good deal. So the amount I'm willing to pay for something is much greater than anybody or most people who are alive for 20 years or 30 years or 40 years. Their time frame is just different. And so their power is different, and the amount of money that they're willing to spend on something is completely different. It completely changes the market because their time frame is like, oh, I want to live in this house for 10 years and then I'll be off to another job, or I'm going to be retiring and moving back home, whatever the frame, but it's not probably 100 years or 200 years.
Right.
And so, what do you do when you have this completely asynchronous time experience and view on cash flows and revenues, these kinds of things?
Right.
So, yeah, it's probably not helpful, but it's not an easy unraveling of corporations being people.
Okay. At Shetcher Boone asked a question about women in libertarianism, and her experience was that the idea of treating yourself as property was positive because communities and family weren't necessarily positive for her initially. She felt like at school there was a lot of alienation, bullying, and in the family there were a lot of pressures. So she writes, in this kind of alienating and ultra individualistic environment, many kids really are not raised by a community or by supportive parents, and instead growing up becomes just a process of raising yourself, learning to defend yourself by yourself, and finding ways to liberate yourself from the controlling and unsupportive people in your surroundings. Part of the appeal of American libertarianism for many people, particularly women, is that it says very emphatically, you are your own property, not your parents' property or anyone else's property. You owe yourself a good life, and you should make it happen regardless of the barriers or cynical, hypocritical guilt trips people place in your way.
Yes, and yes. And that's why I keep saying that the core of the question at the heart of libertarianism, I think, is a great question and needs to be asked and should be asked in a rigorous way. Just for those very reasons, right? That, family, nothing, no more oppressive institution has ever been invented than the family. And particularly for women, who, of course, ownership, like of the whole entire abortion debate, can be seen as part of this, as an extension of this question, is just saying, okay, should women have liberty to control themselves? Is this right? And obviously, this is a huge argument that's going on in the United States and in many other countries around the world, because they're like, oh, no. I thought it was interesting is that some states have passed, because of the reversal of Roe v. Wade in the United States, that made abortion a states' rights issue. Some states have absolute bans on abortion. Okay, so you cannot get an abortion in the state. So, of course, women look around, they go, okay, is there a state near me that I could go to? Of course, this is an imposition already on them. So the states have started saying, is there a way we can keep potentially pregnant women from leaving the state? Right? Like, can we control the movements? I'm not making this up. They're actually trying to figure out if they can do this so that they can keep potentially pregnant women from crossing state lines to get abortions. And so this is like the classic libertarian problem. They're like, look, it's your body. You should do what you want with it. And what the government is going to do is come up with reasons to interfere with not just your ability to have an abortion, but now all of a sudden your ability to have free movement. And then before you know it, right, we're back to the Middle Ages, where you didn't have freedom of speech or freedom of thought or freedom of movement. And so this is why it's generally considered a liberal movement in the libertarian idea. So yes, and yes. The question, though, is how do you create a governing structure, again, that maximizes this opportunity for the maximum number of people, I guess, if you want to do a Benthamite kind of best reward for most people analysis on libertarianism. How do you create a government that allows this, that does this, that speaks to this? And again, very good question, but almost no answers from the front on the libertarian front. Besides, you just say the government should get out of the way. It's like, okay, shut down the schools. Then you don't have to go to a school that's alienating. That would certainly do something, but I don't know if that's a great answer. I would tend to think it's not a great answer, but you can make that argument, I guess.
Yeah. And you personally had kind of like the opposite reaction about the idea of owning yourself. You had kind of a negative reaction, and this person had kind of a positive reaction, like that's empowering. So that was interesting to me to
yeah,
see
and it is and again it's I think it devalues. See, I find it as a devaluing of the individual to think of yourself as property, but it is valuable to think of yourself as being important and significant and worthwhile. And it's such a strongly, again, I thank you for this question, because now I think about it, the United States is so strongly materialistic that the greatest compliment we can pay to ourselves is to say we're property, which is to say we're valuable in the way property is valuable. for most of human society in many countries, even today, the notion of saying yourself as property is a means of devaluing yourself, right? Like that would be saying to be a property would be to be a slave. But we're so powerfully materialistic that we actually read being property as, well, that's the best thing you can be because we're valuable things because of that. You know?
Yeah, yeah. There's another question about motherhood, and in your lecture, you talked about motherhood and commerce and how it relates to libertarianism. This person said, the sentimental statements about motherhood are all well and good, but many people enjoy their jobs as well. Does that mean their work has no monetary value and employment should just be an unmonetizable yet precious, quote, beautiful opportunity full of joy, sustained by joyful dancing, instinct, and rations of unseasoned cornmeal, rice, sweet potatoes, and okra, the way we were told that it used to happen back in the day? So kind of flipping the monetary stuff with motherhood into our actual jobs.
Yeah. So, well, one, I think that it was all a joyous celebration of cornmeal back in the day is, of course, somewhat ahistorical, I would say, since slavery was the default condition for much of human history, for much of humanity, unfortunately. Yeah. So this one, the notion that you shouldn't have joy in work, I think, is troublesome. Two, the notion that motherhood and work, right? Like, so again, this is that problem that we think of as working, having a career is great, and people enjoy it. That's great. They, like full marks. Get, if you can get paid, great. Get paid as much as you can, great. Like this is sort of the system we've created. So no worries there. But that doesn't mean all activities should fall under that rubric. Again, I would say this is an oversimplification. And so we have a rubric for some of our activities. Does that mean that should be for all of our activities? So if I get paid to move around and do things, should I always get paid and think of everything I do as work when I move around and do things, right? Like this is so that they're only, again, it's the categories problem, that there's only one mode of being. Well, I'm doing stuff. I'm taking care of my baby. I could be at work taking care of somebody else's baby and getting paid. So why shouldn't I get paid to get my own baby? And or if I'm not getting paid to take care of my baby, why should I get paid to take care of somebody else's? Right? This is but humans are not in a single mode things. Right? You can't have a space and say, oh, like we want to have a monetary system. We want to do a reward system based on money. This is how we've decided to distribute goods and services. Great, fine. Like, okay, you could criticize that. Hello, communism. But let's just say we're going to go with that, and you go, okay, but that doesn't mean that everything is a labor value theory of value. You don't have to have that. It's not everywhere. It doesn't have to be universal. And that's what I find disturbing is when you try to universalize a mode of relationships, and then get confused about that. So that this is okay if your husband or wife, are they basically just prostitutes? Are they basically just hookers? Right? Like if you have sex with them, should you pay them? Should they pay you? Or is it a different kind of relationship? Yeah, this is so this, and then with prostitution, right? This is the same problem. It's like, oh, well, those people get paid to have sex. These people seem to do it for free. And there's, by the way, a lot of research on marriage that talks about the fact that it was an attempt to corral and control access to sexuality, right? So it was like a market interference mechanism. And so, women didn't get their full marriage value because of these market interferences. And it's like, yeah, I don't, is this the best way to sort human desire, contact, emotion, psychology? And I tend to think, no. It's too black and white, too simplified. You want to have more possibilities of ways to relate to things.
Yeah. And your lecture was on American libertarianism. Prajnaseek says, you present American libertarianism of the right as the only kind. It is not. It is a single anomaly. So suggesting that there might be a libertarianism of the left. So the next couple questions are about other kinds of libertarianism, like European libertarianism or leftist libertarianism. Do you know about that stuff?
Yeah, so I do. That's a fine distinction to make, and I will say yes, I agree with that. The point I'm trying to make is in the United States, this is by far the dominant mode of libertarianism, and that the question that is like I said, the question that is asked by libertarianism is a good question that other people have tried to answer. But the moniker of libertarianism, if you want to think, has been hijacked, if you want to think of it that way, by a sort of conservative technocratic mindset that is sort of it has that technocratic element, and it has the sort of survivalist back to the earth moment. But one distinction I can make on the left side of this that I think exposes part of the problem is I've talked to a lot of where I was from. We were sort of the left coast of the United States, right up there in Washington State. We're one of the most liberal areas of the country. And we're living out in pretty rural area. And so there's a lot of back to the earth movement. And what people said is they were self-sufficient.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So this is, hippies living in the woods, off grid, But this is right libertarianism, because this is the idea of, oh, it's for me. I've made myself self-sufficient, right? I grow food for me, right? What I do is it's for me and the people that I identify as being for me. And I want as limited contact with the outside world. And so while it's often identified as being this right-wing thing, it actually goes very deeply across the political spectrum in the United States that has this core notion of freedom means more for me.
Yeah, so it has a Calvinistic element in it.
And it has this, you're in an individual relationship with God, and so you've got to get your shit straight. That's what matters above all. And that kind of concept, again, don't believe me. People I think are more familiar with the right libertarianism, but if you talk to some of these back to the earth hippie people, they will tell you that, oh, I'm off the grid. I don't have to use any of that. I've got a generator. If the power goes out, I'll have power. I've got solar panels. I charge my batteries. I have a garden. I grow 90% of my food, right? And everything comes back to this, like, oh, I bought a little piece of land. Now it's paid for, so I don't have the bank there, and I live there. It is just this continual expression of, oh, I'm independent. I'm not against this. I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but I'm saying this is a very conservative version of personal liberty that is very well represented in many ways by the right. It's not the only one, but it is well represented by the right, although it doesn't seem like it.
And what about European libertarianism? One person wrote in from Europe and said that they got into a libertarian chat room thinking that it was the kind that they are used to, and it was an American libertarian chat room, and basically the guys were just complaining about having to pay child support and that the courts were impinging on their rights, and she just was annoyed and kind of horrified and left. Do you know about how it plays out in Europe?
So so again, this is a huge cultural difference, and the government interference in life in Europe. I'm not familiar with all of Europe, so I'm more familiar with France and to a certain extent Germany, is very different. It comes in different places in different ways, and a lot of their libertarianism that you have expressed is about kinds of government interferences in your life that in the United States we would be like, what the hell? What is that about, right? I'm trying to think of a good example off the top of my head. I'm sure anybody who's European has got like 27 of them off the top of their head, but I'm trying to think of what might be a good one. There's a lot of limits, for instance, on the way you raise your children here. It's more restrictive. The schools tend to be more regimented, for instance. And then when parents start going, oh, hey, in fact, here's an example. A friend of mine, a German friend of mine, I said, oh, you're going to come for a visit? He said, my daughter's not out of school yet, won't be out for another like 4 days, and then doesn't line up with what I need to do. So I said, oh, why don't you just, bring your daughter early? And he's like, what? And I'm like, well, just check her out of school, like take off a couple of days early. And he's like, yeah, welcome to Germany. You're not, no, you don't check your kid a few days early and just take off, right? Like this is, I was like, oh, really? He's like, no, this would be completely not done. But I also think it comes from, like, if you look at European, even nationalism, and nationalist populism that's very popular to talk about these days, it starts from such a high communal base that it's bizarre. Like a right-wing European populist is to the left of the American Democratic Party often on many subjects, right? And it's just so hard for us to see. So I can see where a European libertarian would feel completely at sea with American libertarianism. But it is a cultural history of the United States, so I apologize. I'm being sort of American in good American fashion.
Yes. Can you talk about the golden age of science fiction? This is at Late Boomer asking. Those writers made me a libertarian without me realizing it. So what's the connection between sci-fi books and pulp science fiction and libertarianism?
Yeah. So this is I think this is, I'd never thought about this before, by the way. So I'm running through the classics of science fiction pulp era in my head. So this is definitely an off the cuff answer. But what you find there is, part of it's the novelistic ideal of the hero that can affect things. Part of it is the technocratic idea of, oh, if we have sufficient technological advance, then we don't need so much government interference to take care of things that we can now have technology take care of for us. And so you have all of these stories about either sort of technocratic utopias where everybody's free and liberated, or individual powerful people escaping from the totalitarian power of technology, right? And heading out to find new colonies and found new societies and this great experimentation. So I don't know if that answers specifically about libertarianism. I'd have to know what the books were that you were thinking of. But to me, the great power of science fiction, to sort of pivot slightly, is the ability to reimagine, right? This is the power of fiction, generally science fiction in particular, is to say, hey, you know what? Let's imagine living differently. What would that be? In fact, there's a video game. Now, what is the name? There's a video game that was very popular that basically said, okay, let's take libertarianism. Let's go there. Let's do Ayn Rand libertarianism, and let's live in that world. And it explores the sort of dystopic elements that you would likely get if you did that. BioShock, I think, is what it was called. I think BioShock was set in this sort of libertarian world. Turns out that there's a lot of things that don't look that appealing when you have to wander about in it. So, but yeah, I think that's be interesting to see if that was a strong bent. But the pulp age of science fiction is going to be written by a lot of American men in the 60s and 70s. And it does have that strong individualistic, materialistic, liberty first, Calvinistic concepts in there.
At Lisa Diogard asks about Ayn Rand. She says, at least you didn't mention Ayn Rand. She really didn't like libertarians and didn't like that they claimed her philosophy. She thought that they were a bunch of mindless anarchists. So, I noted that you didn't mention her, but they seem to be pretty popular. Yeah, sorry about the noise. There's some
no problem
down in the back. Yeah,
no problem. Yeah, so if I try not to mention Ayn Rand because someday I'm going to have to do the Ayn Rand lecture, I guess. That's just going to be required. I do kind of want to do that, but I kind of don't want to do that as well. But her particular flavor is, I mean, it depends on, it's a category problem again. How do you label something? And so a lot of libertarians like Ayn Rand's approach and would claim her, as she says, and she doesn't like that, but they would claim her. There are lots of libertarian elements in her writing, but I wouldn't say that she is she was not specifically a libertarian in that sense, but I think it's sort of blended that so the Hayek would not want to have a lot to do with Ayn Rand, right? Like those two people are not going to agree on virtually anything. But the kind of popular libertarianism that's come to the fore in the United States and the kind of popular version of Ayn Rand's ideas that come to the fore in the United States do form a pretty good Venn diagram, right? They have a lot of overlapping there. So, yeah.
Okay. And that Robert asks what might be the final question here. Why is the Libertarian Party so unpopular despite libertarianism being so culturally pervasive in America?
Great question. So if in American politics, here's the trick. People say, why are there only two parties in American politics? One, they're entrenched, they're insanely powerful, and the way our elections run is bizarre. So it's not intuitive in any way. If you're not in America, you probably have absolutely no idea how our elections run because it's so bizarre as to be unbelievable. But having said that, what happens is both political parties just continually shop around for ideas. So when a third-party candidate starts getting some votes, Ross Perot, for instance, one or both of the parties just look at it and go, "Oh, that's a good idea. Like we're just going to take it." And we have more advertising money, we have more exposure, we have more political power, we have more access to the media. And so we just take this popular idea and make it our own. And we go, "Oh, this is our idea. This is us." Like, you know, you can flat tax. Okay, we're going to do flat tax. Like flat tax is popular. Okay, we're going to do that. Or, I mean, you just saw this in the recent election. So Trump was apparently in Nevada, and someone said to him, like, "Hey, get rid of the tax on tips. A lot of tipped workers in Nevada, and you're supposed to pay income tax on your tips." So you're like, "Oh, okay, there you go. Let's do that." So Trump announced that. He said, "Yeah, we're going to eliminate the tax on tips." And everybody in Nevada was like, "Woo!" It's a battleground state, right? Everybody's like, "Oh, that's great. We love you. That's, you're going to cut our taxes. We think you're a good guy." And so like a week later, the Kamala Harris, get her name right, Kamala Harris announced that, "Oh yeah, we're absolutely going to cut taxes on tips." Right? So the parties are not, they have certain ideological cores, but what they also are is they're just continually shopping for any idea that looks like it might get them some votes. And if a party that starts to get sufficient grip to become popular, they either just get wholesale absorbed by one of the existing party, or the party just takes all their ideas. You can't compete with them. It's sort of like a small business versus a large business. You're doing great. You're selling fruit juice for $1 a thing, and you're like, "Well, we're making money. We're selling fruit juice." And Coca-Cola comes along and says, "Oh, fruit juice is popular." This has literally happened, by the way. "Fruit juice is popular. We're going to sell fruit juice for 50 cents a bottle." Drive those people out of business, and then we own the fruit business, right? Yay. And so this is what you do. And so any kind of libertarian ideal that really caught the popular imagination, that got traction for the Libertarian Party, would be instantly picked up by one or both parties, and it would lose all of its resonance. That doesn't mean this can never happen. Some political scientists are saying that if the election goes very, very badly for the Republicans, they may have to completely rebuild themselves, or a third party might actually emerge. But it's unlikely, I would say, historically speaking. But it has happened in the past, could happen again. But the two parties are so good at this that it makes it difficult for another party, libertarian or of any other kind, to get traction.
All right. And this last question is actually a comment, and it's light. It's from @JFalcony, and they say, "Hello from this libertarian's tiny house in North Carolina. I feel seen and attacked at the same time. Got to give credit where credit's due. This thumbnail was a major gotcha on me that made me laugh. Delighted to listen and learn."
Oh, thank you for that. Yeah, hello to the tiny house people. Again, I have nothing against the tiny house movement, but I just think it's so emblematic of American ideals that I do tend to return to it as as an exemplary statement on that. And just to take it in that mode for a second, I do think this is also the positive side of the libertarian idea, is because if you like where you are and you can live in a small house and you're comfortable there, and you're don't have high payments or you have no payment, this does free you, right? If you have a $500,000, $750,000 mortgage, 250, this is a potentially a burden. You might say, no, this is a great deal. I love where I live. I'm happy with that. Or you might say, no, this is terrible. This doesn't work. I'm unhappy with this. But if you don't have to have those resources and that time and that energy going towards, even if you own your house outright, maintenance costs, blah, 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 you're like, no, I got things to do. I want to go backpacking. I want to go kayaking. I want to go to the park and watch my dog run around. I don't want to worry about a house. I don't want to pay for a house. Like, yeah, that is liberty. So this is why the core question at the heart of libertarianism is really perhaps one of the most fundamental any individual can ask themselves. It's just the way it's been transmogrified into the popular discourse is both incredibly emblematic of American cultural ideals, hence the reason I wanted to talk about it, and also I find somewhat disturbing.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you to the listeners for your questions. In the future, if you could please ask the questions in a question form. A lot of times these are comments that actually have a question in them, and I'm kind of finding the question. So just a little note, if you could ask them with a question mark, that would help the podcast. So thank you.
Yeah. And thanks everybody for asking the questions, and thanks Jeremy for being my interpreter of these. I appreciate it very much. And yeah, sign up for the class. Not too much longer now. Look forward to seeing everybody soon. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you, Wes.